This week, we're going to go ahead and wrap up our summer series, which means next week, we're starting a new series. And I'm really excited about this series. We're starting a series called No Outsiders, where we're going to be looking at how the good news of Jesus, it's not just for people who have their life together, right? It's not just for people who have been in church all their life. See, the problem is, I feel like we've developed this mentality that you've got to almost fix your life before you have an encounter with Jesus. You've got to be perfect before you have a religious experience. I don't know where this idea comes from, but I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations with people who come into church and they're like, man, I don't know, I was kind of worried coming to church because I was really afraid that lightning would strike me. And I'm always like, where did this come from? Where is this idea coming from, right? Because the reality is, as you look at the stories of Jesus, what you see is that Jesus, it's almost like he gravitates towards the outsiders. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like he's always going to the outcasts. He's always going to the people that you would least expect. And so next week, we're going to start this series again called No Outsiders, where we're going to be looking at several stories about how Jesus tends to go to the most unexpected of people. But this week, we're wrapping up this summer series. Check this out. For the last 14 weeks, we have been looking at Jesus' famous sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. And so if you haven't been with us, basically what we've been doing throughout the summer is just kind of walking through this sermon chapter by chapter, verse by verse, Matthew 5, all the way through Matthew chapter 7. And today, we're wrapping it up. So if you got your Bible, do me a favor, turn with me for the last time, at least in this series, to Matthew chapter 7. Again, we're in Matthew chapter 7. If you don't have a Bible, we should have one in the chair in front of you. If you've got one of those, we're going to be on page 812. Again, that's page 812. And while you're turning there, I've got to do just kind of a quick review, if that's okay, just to catch everybody up and make sure we're all on the same page. Because again, when Jesus was giving the sermon, remember that this was one long, continuous sermon. And the reason this is important is because every single one of these teachings are connected. You see, the problem is I feel like a lot of times when we look at this sermon, we tend to see them as all of these individual thoughts, don't we? Well, this is Jesus' thoughts on anger. This is his thoughts on adultery, on worry. This is his thoughts on judging people. And so we kind of put them in their own separate categories. And the problem is when we do that, we actually miss the thing that unites them all together. We end up missing the bigger picture of what Jesus is trying to say. And if you haven't been with us throughout this series, the big picture theme that we've been talking about is generosity. And how as followers of Jesus, we're called to live a generous life. We're called to live a life of grace that goes above and beyond the expectations of others. And so with that then, as we've gone through this series, we've talked a lot about our actions, a lot about like how do we respond to the good news of Jesus in our life? How does that change our everyday life? For example, last week, Matthew 7, verse 21, Jesus said something kind of controversial. He says, not everybody who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And at first, we're kind of taken aback. We're like, whoa, like that's hardcore, Jesus. What's up with that? And the key to understanding this verse is that phrase, the kingdom of heaven. Because we need to understand that the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of God is different than just heaven. Heaven is heaven, but when Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven, what he's talking about is anything that is under the reign of God right here, right now, even in our lives. And so check this out. When we're obedient to God, when we do what God calls us to do, little by little, we begin to create the kingdom of God in and through our lives, with our actions, with our words, with our attitudes, with the way that we treat each other, that we slowly begin to create God's kingdom right here, right now, or as Jesus says in Luke, I think it's 17:21, that the kingdom of God is in your midst. And so what Jesus is saying here when he says not everybody who says, but the one who does, basically what he's saying is, look, if you want to live the life that God's created you to live, if you want to create the kingdom of God through your life, you can't fake it. You can't just put on a good front, right? You can't just give all the right answers. it's not about what you say, it's about what you do. And so again, we've been talking a lot about our actions and the way that we respond. And the problem is when you talk a lot about actions, it's easy for us to jump to the wrong conclusions. It's easy for us to begin to convince ourselves, well, maybe I can earn my salvation somehow. That maybe I can earn my way into heaven. And we need to remember that's not biblical at all. That the only way that we're saved is by the grace of God. One of our verses that's been our go-to throughout this whole series is Ephesians 2, 8 and 9, that we are saved by grace through faith and faith alone in Jesus. He goes on to say, not by works, so that nobody can boast, right? We need to stay anchored in the truth that we're saved by grace, but we're still called to respond. We're still called to live a life of grace. And so the question is what are we doing with the grace that God has given us? And so again, we've had this big emphasis on our actions and the way that we respond. And you're going to see that again today. So if you've got your Bible, do me a favor. We're going to be in Matthew 7, verse 24. And what I'm going to do, just kind of give you a little heads up on where we're going. I'm going to read through these verses. We're going to look at the big picture, talk about it just a little bit, and then I'm going to double back and just kind of break it down verse by verse so that we can kind of get to the deeper thing that's going on there. And so hopefully you're there by now because I'm going for it either way. Matthew 7, verse 24, Jesus says this, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. And the rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. Verse 26, everyone then who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain fell, the floods came, the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. Now, what we want to do is read these verses and just kind of look at the big picture, don't we? We look at the big picture and say, okay, obviously what's happening here is that Jesus is giving us this contrast between building a foundation on rock and building a foundation on sand. And the problem is if you build a foundation on sand, that's not very solid, is it? The problem with sand is it's always moving. It's always shifting, it's unreliable, it feels kind of unstable. And so obviously, if we build our foundation on sand, the picture that we get is that we're setting ourselves up for failure, that this is gonna go downhill. And so we need to build a foundation on rock because rock is stable, rock is sturdy, rock is reliable. And so we look at these verses and say, okay, what Jesus is saying here is that he is the rock. And we need to build our foundation on him, that he needs to be the center of our life. And the problem is our temptation is to try to build a foundation on other things, isn't it? I mean, we do this all the time. For example, our jobs. Some of us are here today and we try to build a foundation on our jobs, and so we throw everything that we have into our jobs. For some of us, it's a relationship in our life. For some of us, it's some sort of material things, and it's always kind of having the newest thing or the newest gadget. And the problem is that when we build a foundation on those things, it's like building a foundation on sand, because all of those things were never meant to be the center of our lives. And if we try to build a foundation, for example, on our job, it's only gonna fall apart, because the reality is at some point in your life, you're probably gonna leave your job, aren't you? Whether you're laid off or you're fired or you get angry and you quit or you just retire. That job isn't your everything, and at that point, well, what is it? And if you try to build your foundation on a person, the problem is well, people are flawed, aren't we? We all make mistakes. We're all sinful. My wife just gave me a look. That was her way of saying amen without saying amen. Right? And if we try to build a foundation on people, the reality is they're not going to meet the expectations that we have of them, because we expect perfection. And when we don't get perfection, we get let down. If you build your foundation on other people alone, I'm telling you, it's going to let you down. If you build your life on materials and things, problem is there's always a new thing. There's always a new gadget. There's always something new coming out. It's like somebody's always moving the finish line. And when we try to build our foundation on all these peripheral things, it's going to fall apart, because they were never meant to be the center of your life, that it's only in Jesus. And so what we do is we look at this big picture of the foundation and building the foundation on the rock. And by the way, all of that is true, isn't it? That absolutely, we need to make Jesus the center of our life. But the problem is that usually this is where our approach to Bible study stops. We look at this and say, okay, I'm looking for an answer. What are these verses about? We get an answer, that's good enough, we'll move on. And the problem is when you do this, when you just kind of take the answer and say that's good enough and then move on to the next thing, we end up missing so much more. Because check it out, these verses are some of those verses that are just jam-packed, loaded with meaning. That there's all of this depth. Remember that Jesus was a Hebrew thinker. And one of the things that we've been talking about, if you've been with us, is that in Hebrew thought, it's always about the word pictures. And what is this describing? What are they thinking of when they hear these words? And so some of the questions we need to ask ourselves is, okay, wait, like when Jesus talks about a foundation, what's that look like? When he talks about building your house on the rock, when he describes the rock, what are the original people who are in that crowd thinking of in that moment? Or when he says we're going to build a foundation on sand, what are they picturing? Because I'm pretty sure every single one of us in here is picturing beachfront property, aren't we? I mean, that's what I'm thinking. And to be honest, I'm thinking, I don't know, Jesus, that sounds pretty good, doesn't it? I really miss being able to look out and see the beach every now and then. That sounds nice. But understand this, in the first century Israel, they didn't have sand like that. You don't have sand like that in Israel. That's not the way that it's set up. And so when they talk about building a house on sand, they're thinking of something very, very different than what you and I are thinking about. These are the questions that we need to ask. And so what I want to do is go back through these verses and just kind of look a little bit deeper so that we can see the bigger picture that Jesus is painting with our words. And when we do this, what happens, we begin to understand what it means to build a foundation on him and exactly why it's such a big deal. And so again, I want to look at these verses. We're going to begin Matthew 7:24. Jesus says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them will be like the wise man who built his house on the rock." Let me ask you, simple question. According to Jesus, what's the difference between a wise man and a fool? What does the wise man do that's different? Right. How do you do that? Not the one who just hears, but the one who does, right? It's not just about what you hear, it's about what you do. It's the action that's involved. And the problem that we have with this is that we live in a culture of learning where knowledge is important. Knowledge is a priority, isn't it? We live in a culture that says knowledge is power. And if you grew up in the 80s like I did, you know what G.I. Joe taught you, that knowing is half the battle. This is especially true in church world, isn't it? We are all about learning. We are all about knowledge. We emphasize things like Sunday morning worship, small groups, and Bible studies. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with those things because you have to be able to understand the scriptures to know how to apply them, right? Like you just have to be able to do that. Because again, knowing is half the battle. But the problem is, it's only half the battle. It's only one piece of the puzzle. And if you want to build a foundation on the rock, then it's not just about what you hear. It's about what you do. Because check this out. Obedience, and when we're obedient to God, that's actually how we begin to create a foundation on the rock. Are you with me? That the act of obedience is how we begin to build that foundation on the rock. Now, before I get into that and how that whole thing works, I need to talk for a second about the rock, right? Because again, they're living in a picturesque world where they're all about creating word pictures with their words. And so when Jesus talks about the rock, their mind would have automatically started picturing certain things. This is just like our world, by the way. We do this, don't we? In fact, just for fun, I want you to close your eyes, but don't sleep. Close your eyes. There's always one. If I say the rock, what is the first thing that you picture? Be honest. Thank you. How many of you, the first thing you pictured Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson? Was anybody else in that boat? I'll be honest. Well, I was going to say, I'll be honest, I was thinking about that too, but now I'm self-conscious. But all week as I was practicing, every time I said "The Rock," all I pictured was Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Why do we do that? Check this out. Because as a culture, we have been conditioned to think of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson every time we hear "The Rock," because he's in all of these movies, and all of these movie posters, whenever you see his face, you have these giant words over it that says "The Rock," and maybe you get Dwayne Johnson kind of as a lower print thing, right? As a culture, we have been conditioned by society to associate the phrase "The Rock" with this individual. And the same thing is true in their culture, but remember, their culture was very different from ours. Clearly, they weren't thinking of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson when Jesus is talking about the rock. That they lived in a culture where Scripture was the center of their world. This is a world before TV and movies, that really the Bible was even a lot of their entertainment. The Bible was a lot of what they would talk about when they would just get together with a family. And so the question we need to ask then is, as we go through the Scriptures, where do we see this phrase "the rock"? And what is it describing? And what's interesting, especially in the Old Testament, what you see is that this phrase "the rock" is often used as a descriptor of God himself. You see this multiple times. And what's interesting, it's kind of in clusters. Like in Deuteronomy 32, you'll have like 3 references to God as the rock. But the one that I want to look at comes out of Psalm 18. Psalm 18 has like 3 or 4 references to God as the rock. But I want to look at verse 2, Psalm 18, verse 2. You can turn there really quick, or you can just write it down, check it out later, and look at it yourself. But I just want to read through these words, and I want you to just kind of think to yourself, okay, is there anything in common with these? Like, what are they describing? If I were to close my eyes and picture the rock here and what it's describing, what do I see? Listen to this. See if there's anything that's kind of repetitive. The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield, the horn of salvation, and my stronghold. Did you notice a trend? Did you kind of pick up on it? 4 times. 4 times in those verses, we saw reference to God as some sort of protector. God is a refuge. God is a fortress, a stronghold, a shield. 4 different times we see that the God as a rock is some sort of protection in our life. And so understand, when Jesus is talking about building a foundation on the rock, this is the picture they're describing. That as we go through hard and difficult seasons of life, that God will be some sort of protection, that God will be our refuge, our shield, our strength, our stronghold. And again, the way that we begin to create that foundation is through obedience. Which, at least for me, I don't know about you guys, but for me, that kind of raises a question. Like, how does that work? How does obedience begin to develop that foundation on the rock? And what's interesting is the answer to this, the reason this is true, is because it's something we've been talking about just over and over and over throughout this series. One of the things that we've been talking about is this idea that when we're obedient to God, he meets us in the obedience. One of the ways that we talked about it earlier is that the way that we live a generous life is by learning to live in the generosity of God. And the idea here is when we take that leap of faith, what happens is that God meets us in the middle of that obedience. And so even though things don't always seem like they're going to work out, sometimes that's why we call it a leap of faith, right? It's scary. There's kind of this level of trust. It feels like we're diving out into oblivion, hoping that God's going to meet us there. And as we leap, what we see is that God meets us in our obedience. I love the example in Joshua chapter 3. God goes to Joshua. This is after Moses died. I love it because it's like the first thing that happens after Moses dies. It's a great part about being a leader. There's no like warm-up time. They just kind of throw you in. God tells them to cross the Jordan. We're going to take the promised land. But what I love about that story is that the way that God leads them across the Jordan is different than the way he led them across the Red Sea. When God leads them across the Red Sea, Moses stands in front, he holds up the staff, the waters part, and they cross on the dry ground. But in Joshua 3, it's different. The priests start to cross the Jordan. I wonder how long they waited for the waters to part. And then they realized it wasn't going to happen, so they're like, oh, I guess we're just going to have to do this the other way. And so they start to walk in the waters, and as they step in the waters, then the waters part. You see, when we're obedient to God, it's in the midst of our obedience that God meets us in those moments to remind us that he is faithful, that he is just, and he's there with us. And so as we follow God, as we're obedient to God, he meets us in those moments. And the first time we take a leap of faith, it's scary, isn't it? If you've been there, you know what I'm talking about. It's kind of this terrifying moment. I guess we're going to put everything on the line, and I hope God shows up. And then you do it, and it works out. And the reason this is important is because the next time God says, hey, I want you to do this, and it's scary, and it's intimidating, and you don't know how it's going to work out, all of a sudden, you can kind of look back, right? You can look back and say, okay, wait, I met God in that moment last time. Like, I saw God work in the impossible, and I know that he can do it again because he did it once before. And so it gets a little bit easier to take that second leap than it was the first, isn't it? And so all of a sudden, you begin to develop this track record. You take that next leap of faith, God meets you in that moment, and then another opportunity comes. And in that moment, there's kind of that same fear, but it's not as bad as it was because now you have this track record of experiencing God in the midst of your obedience. You see, what Jesus is saying here is that when we're obedient to God, we begin to develop trust in him. Because the problem that we have, let's be honest, is trust. We have trust issues when it comes to God. How many of us have ever had that moment where we felt like God was calling us to do something and we didn't want to do it? Because we were afraid, what if God doesn't show up? We have trust issues. But the more we put our faith in him, the more we take that leap of faith, the more that we're obedient to him, the more we experience him. And the more we experience him, the less we're afraid as we come across the hard and difficult times of life. The less we're afraid, the more God says, hey, I want you to do this. I want you to do this. Because we have this track record of experiencing God. And before long, it's like, okay, this is just what God does, right? It's just the way you ever know somebody who was just kind of the way they were? Like somebody who was either always joking or somebody who was always faithful or somebody who was always just persistent. It's just like the way they are. See, that's the way that God is. He's just faithful. And when you are obedient, he meets you in that obedience. And as we begin to be obedient, as we experience him, we ourselves begin to trust him more and more and more. We begin to create that foundation on the rock because we're putting our faith not necessarily in what we see, not necessarily in what we feel, not necessarily in what our mind, like our rationality is telling us. We're putting our faith and trust in him because we know in spite of our senses, I can trust him. And the reason this is such a big deal is because of what it says in verse 25. Check this out. Verse 25 says this, and the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on the rock. What I love about this verse is that it teaches us that even if you build your foundation on the rock, there are still going to be hard times in life. See, unfortunately, I think sometimes we convince ourselves that if we choose to follow Jesus, we're never going to go through hard times. And in fact, I've actually been in churches where people like me stood on stages like this and said, you know, if you give your life to Jesus, you're never going to go through hard times again. Like everything's just going to sort of work itself out. And the reality is that life is filled with ups and downs, isn't it? And in fact, I'll be totally honest with you. Sometimes obedience to God leads you directly into storms. There have been times when we said yes to God and God's like, okay, here's a storm. Here's a flood. In fact, look at the Bible. Notice the amount of stories where people's faithfulness immediately leads them into hard times. Being a follower of Jesus does not abdicate us from going through difficult times and difficult seasons of life. It prepares us. Because when we have that track record of trusting God, when we experience the storms, when we experience the flood, the winds, the hail of life, we know that we are safe. We know that we're secure. It's going to be scary, yeah. Just like if you're in a house, right, and you hear the hail, I don't care how well that house is built, there's a part of you that's scared, isn't it? Or you're worried because you know you're probably going to have to get a new roof. It's scary, it's hard, it's difficult, but you're secure because you've built this foundation of trust in God and you know that he has your back. You know that if he led you to this moment, he's going to lead you through this moment. See, building a foundation on the rock does not abdicate you from difficult times. It prepares you to be able to handle it. Verse 26. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain fell, the floods came, and it blew and beat against the house, and it fell. And great was the fall of it. Now, again, with these words, we picture beachfront property, right? We picture like this beautiful view, this big house, and all of this beach as far as the eye can see. And again, the problem is that's not their world. That they're describing something that's very, very different than what we're expecting. You see, especially in first century Israel, the only place that you're going to find sand, at least big enough for any sort of foundation like that, is in what's known as a wadi. Now, if you're not familiar with wadis, a wadi is a dried up riverbed. They're found in the desert. They're found in the wasteland. And these wadis are the most dangerous place that you can be in Israel, even today. And the reason they're so dangerous is because, check this out. You can be in a wadi in the middle of a day like this where it's just gorgeous outside. Sun is shining, maybe not even a cloud in sight. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you could get blasted by a flash flood. Thousands upon thousands of gallons of water all at once. And in fact, even today in Israel, it's not uncommon to hear stories of people who go missing. And the reason they've gone missing is because they got caught in a wadi during a flash flood. Now what happens, again, it's a dried riverbed, right? Which means at some point there was water in that thing. And so what happens is in the mountains, miles and miles and miles away, it rains. The water is going to flow down the mountain, make its way into that dried riverbed, and that's where the flash flood comes from. See, what Jesus is saying here is that when you build a foundation on anything other than him, that you're setting yourself up for failure. And the failure, it's not like it's going to slowly pick you apart, because that's how we almost picture a house on sand being destroyed, right? Just kind of little by little, the flood waters are rising, and slowly the sand starts moving, and the next thing you know, the front porch goes by, and then the next thing you know, something else kind of breaks apart, then half the house kind of falls apart, and it's slowly being picked away. That's not the picture here. It's more like just being completely and utterly blasted away by a flash flood. This thing stood no chance whatsoever. That when we build our foundation on anything other than Jesus, we are setting ourselves up for failure. That when we don't live a life of obedience, where we're developing that trust in God, what happens is when we go through these difficult times and difficult seasons, we panic. And we start to put our trust in everything else, and it just makes matters worse. You see, it's absolutely essential that we are obedient to God, because obedience in God is how we begin to develop that relationship with him. Verse 28. And when Jesus finished saying these things, crowds were astonished at his teachings, for he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not as their scribes. Now, if you've been with us before, we've talked about this idea of authority and how Jesus was different from the rabbis in the first century world because he was a rabbi with authority. See, when it talks about scribes, it's talking about just kind of Torah teachers. This is what we would probably call your run-of-the-mill rabbi in the first century. And please understand, like, they weren't ordinary by any means. These guys were absolutely brilliant. They put me to shame with the way that they knew the Bible. These guys were brilliant, but rabbis with authority were a step above. One of the things that made them different is they were able to do new teachings on Scripture For example, whenever Jesus says, "You have heard it said, but I say," that's a new teaching. Not any rabbi could do that. And rabbis with authority were extremely rare. During the 100 years around Jesus, there were maybe 12 of these guys. So they're incredibly rare. Also, and this is going to be important in a minute, they were also the only rabbis who were known healers. And so if somebody had issues, if somebody was sick, the rabbis were known to be healers. Now, this is usually where we stop with the sermon, isn't it? We look at it and we say, okay, this is the end of the sermon, and so usually this is where we stop. I just want to read a little bit more if that's cool. And the reason I want to do that is because I think it's important that we see immediately what happens next. Because again, our temptation is to read these by different segments. And so whenever we hit a chapter break or a paragraph break, we're like, oh, something else, and we move on. Remember, the key to this whole thing was the continuity. And so with that said, look at Matthew 8, verse 1. When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. Picture it. Jesus walks off the mountain and all these people are going with him, right? What's about to happen is like immediately after. This isn't weeks later. He comes down the mountain. This great crowd followed him. Verse 2. And behold, a leper came to him, knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand, touched him, saying, I will be clean. Immediately, his leprosy was clean. Now, leprosy was a big deal in the first century world. It was a skin disease, and most people believed it was transmitted by touching. I want you to notice the way that Jesus heals the man. He doesn't heal the man by speaking, does he? And he could have, right? I mean, as we look at the story of Jesus, there's lots of times where he's like, yeah, be healed. And the dude was healed. But he doesn't do that here. What does he do? He touches him. Why is that a big deal? It's risky, isn't it? It's taking a bit of a leap. Now, I know he's Jesus. And so I think what we want to do is say, oh, well, he's Jesus. And so we just kind of put that on the side. But no, think about this for a minute. Because one of the things you need to understand about rabbis in the first century is the rabbi would never call you to do something that he wouldn't do himself. This entire series we've been talking about going above and beyond, about living a generous life of grace, exceeding the expectations of others. And the first thing that Jesus does is he heals somebody. He's backing it up with his words, but he doesn't just heal somebody. He touches this person who's probably hasn't been touched in years. Can you imagine the grace? Could you imagine what that must have felt like for somebody who'd been like shunned, who'd been avoided like the plague? Jesus shows incredible grace because he's been telling us, partially because he's been telling us, and immediately he shows us what it looks like. And what's awesome is as we go through Matthew chapter 8, notice the stories that happen right after. Jesus there's this centurion whose servant is sick and he heals them. Peter's mother-in-law is sick, he heals her. There are demon-possessed people, he heals them. That the whole next section, Jesus just goes about healing people. You see, he doesn't just talk the talk, but he walks the walk. He shows us what it looks like to live a life of abundant grace, what it looks like to live a life of abundant generosity. And so the question that we need to ask ourselves as we wrap up is, how are we being obedient to God? How are we doing what God's called us to do? How are we going above and beyond, raising the standards, blowing away everybody else's expectations? Maybe for you, it's with your family. Because if you're anything like me, sometimes family's hard, isn't it? I think the reason it's hard is because we're so busy with life. It's almost like our family gets the leftovers. You ever feel that way? It's like you get home from work, you get home from, especially if you've got kids, you're driving them everywhere. By the time you get done, you're like, I am done. The problem is you're just done 5 days a week. Saturday is all about recover. And let's be honest, you probably got a lot of stuff going on Saturday and Sunday too, that we're just so busy. That it's like our family gets our extra time. They get our leftovers. And the question maybe we need to ask is, with our family, how are we being obedient to God? How are we going above and beyond and showing our family the same grace that we're trying to show the world? Because if they don't learn it from, if your kids, if your family doesn't learn it from you, where are they going to learn it? Maybe for you, it's with your job. Maybe for you, it's just kind of a 9 to 5. You're just kind of trying to survive. You're just trying to get through. But what if God wants you to do something while you're there? What are the ways that you can go above and beyond to begin to show the grace and the love and the mercy of God to your coworkers or the people you're serving even? What would it look like if you just kind of stopped and said, okay, God, how do you want me to use my job, my environment to be obedient to you? God, what are you calling me to do while I'm here? Maybe for you it's your finances and just finding opportunities to be generous, whether it's to the church or individuals, people that you know that are hurting and suffering. Maybe for you it's just taking a little bit of a leap there that God's calling you to be obedient. Maybe for you it's another relationship, it's a friendship in your life. I don't know what it is for you. But the question we need to ask is, what's God calling me to do right here, right now? Because I promise you, God's calling you. I promise you, God's saying something. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, how are we being obedient to God? Are you listening? Are we really looking for what God wants us to do? Because if you do, I'm telling you, he's kind of talkative. He'll say something. Let's pray. God, thank you. Thank you for Jesus, for this sermon, all 14 weeks. God, I thank you for Jesus and his obedience, that he never just talked the talk, but he lived a life of abundant grace so that we could experience abundant grace. God, I pray that you would be with us throughout this week, that you would show us the opportunities that are in front of us. Give us eyes to see what you're calling us to do, and give us the courage to say yes, even when it's the scariest thing in the world, because we know that you're going to meet us in that moment. We know that you're faithful and that you're just. Help us to live a life that builds a foundation on the rock, so that when we go through the hard and the difficult times and the difficult seasons, we can have confidence that you will have our back. For it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.